Chapter 10. As Jimmy hugged the field line, he stayed 15 to 20 feet into the woods. Every once in a while, he would pop out in a low crouch and make sure he wasn't getting off course. Retreating back into the woods, he knew that he was inching closer. As he continued his walk, every once in a while, a rustle in the trees would grab his attention. Squirrels, he muttered to himself. He wished that he hadn't left his watch at home. He had lost all track of time, and since the sun was behind the gloomy gray clouds, he had no way of estimating based on its location in the sky. Once he thought he was more or less parallel with the smoke, Jimmy began to make his way across the field and in the direction of what he presumed to be Karst Valley. Creeping along very low at first, he finally stood up after he could no longer take the burning sensation that his thighs were firing off in rapid intervals. He finally saw buildings and hurried toward them. He crossed over a rock-filled and deep ditch and reached the backside of a shopping center. He was convinced that it was the one that contained his new favorite Mexican restaurant. Deciding to go around to the front to confirm, there was a commotion that caught his attention. Heart racing again, he crept to the edge of the building. He saw the taillights first, glowing red in anger. Next, he noticed the police flashers and peeked around the side of the building as the ruckus grew. "Get back, sir! No, ma'am! Get back! Please, I don't want to have to shoot. Stay back! Stop! Get on the ground! That is a direct order!" The policeman had drawn his gun and was pointing center mass as a man lurched forward. A group of 5 to 7 more were walking towards him, dragging their feet and walking in a way that reminded Jimmy of how his grandpa had walked just before death. "Final warning. I'll use my gun if you do not obey my commands. Get down on the ground. Down! Now!" Jimmy looked on, terrified. He was still trying to process what was happening as the pistol began firing. The man closest to the officer consumed the bullets as they ripped through his midsection. The group behind him had intensified their pace and were now lumbering towards the officer. They ran slowly, but Jimmy noticed that they were not pumping their arms. They were dangling at their sides as their legs churned. "It looks almost like a chicken running," Jimmy thought to himself as the horror consumed him. An unfortunate click signified that the pistol was empty. No one in the crowd seemed even remotely affected by the sound of the gunshots. They did not crouch down. They did not run away. Instead, they converged on the officer, who was screaming, and began to beat him intensely. They began scraping, clawing, and biting him. It looked like an 8-on-1 fight. Jimmy turned his head, unable to continue watching. What is happening? That man was shot an insane number of times and didn't flinch. The others in the group seemed aroused by the loud pops of the pistol. Remaining quiet and hiding behind the corner, Jimmy waited until the mob had wandered off a safe distance. He ran for the officer. Once he arrived, he asked, "Are you all right?" "Officer? What happened? Can you talk?" Jimmy's voice was frightened and low. The policeman struggled through guttural moans as he said, "Help. Me." "How do I call for backup?" Jimmy asked shakily. "There is no backup. Help." The officer trailed off as a gargling sound escaped his lips. "What? What do you mean?" Jimmy stared at the officer as a drop of blood began to trickle from the corner of his mouth. The officer inhaled deeply and mouthed, "Help." Okay. I've got to get you to a hospital. You're bleeding all over. They scratched you right through your coat and shirt. I'm going to get you some help. Where are the keys to your car?" The officer could only point. He was delirious, in shock. With all of his might, Jimmy grabbed the overweight cop and began dragging him toward the car. The group of people seemed to ignore what Jimmy was doing. For now. He whipped open the rear passenger side door and crawled into the back seat, dragging the officer with him. Once Jimmy had gotten him onto the seat, he hopped out of the other door. After closing all doors, Jimmy looked up. The mob had turned their attention back to him and were slowly staggering back toward him, 40 to 50 feet away. He turned and made his way quickly to the driver's seat. "Where are your keys, sir?" he asked, checking the dash and visor. Nothing. I need to know where your keys are, buddy. I've got to get you down to the hospital right away and I need your keys. Stay with me, Jimmy screamed. Ig, na, shun, ig, na, shun. The officer trailed off. After taking a moment for his words to register, Jimmy realized what the officer was trying to say. He cranked the keys and the engine fired up. Luckily, the old hospital was on this side of town, although Jimmy had only ever been to the new one for the birth of Ethan. Racing down city streets, unsure of where the entrance was, Jimmy came flying into the main parking lot and began to search frantically for signs. ER, with an arrow to the right. After trying to follow them and making unnecessary turns, Jimmy finally located the emergency room entrance. He pulled up to the front, sprinted from the door without closing it, and began to drag the limp body into the hospital. I have an officer who was attacked, he began shouting as the automatic doors peeled away. His back to the desk, Jimmy was holding the officer under the armpits and trying desperately to drag him in through the doors. I have an officer down. He was attacked, beat up by a group of people in a shopping center. I don't know his name, but he needs help now. Turning around to face the receptionist, he instantly noticed that her eyes were bloodshot. She had a Kleenex in one hand, typing with the other as she rubbed her profoundly pink nose. This man needs help. He's a police officer and I found... Okay, sir, I understand. You will need to fill out these forms and wait with everyone else before we can see him. Her voice hoarse and nasally. Jimmy assumed that she must have had the flu too. But he's going to die if you don't save him. He's bleeding everywhere. What happened, sir? I told you, he was attacked by a group of people. They beat him nearly to death. They scratched him, bit him, and then they just left. Okay, sir. Fill out the paperwork and we will do our best to accommodate him. How do you know this man, sir? I don't. I came up to the parking lot and he shot a man 8 times. The guy didn't flinch. He didn't stop. He just kept coming. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm just trying to help this man, Jimmy shouted, finally looking out into the crowd of onlookers. He's going to bleed out if you don't. Jimmy cut his shouting short and noticed that most people in the communal waiting room had red eyes. Most noses were red. Their ears ranged from bright pink to nearly maroon. Some were hunched over in the corners. They looked like they were already dead. Jimmy lost all orientation as he took a step back. Some were staggering around slowly, but no one talked. They looked as if they had the same ailment as those that had attacked the officer. What is going on around here? Are all of these people sick? Everyone looks like they have the same problem, Jimmy demanded, refusing to take his eyes off of the crowd. A man standing against the wall whose back was to him caught his attention. He was tall with dark hair but severely hunched over. The man suddenly straightened, looked up to the ceiling, and then crooked his neck unnaturally, looking in Jimmy's direction. Jimmy shot a glance at the nurse, who was rubbing her nose with the wet Kleenex. She began to say something, but all of Jimmy's focus returned to the man who turned fully and took an unhealthy step towards him. He noticed that a lot of heads were doing the same thing, almost in unison. What are these people doing? Jimmy's voice fluttered with worry. The receptionist was still talking, but her words were unclear. The mob was slowly inching their way toward Jimmy and the officer. Jimmy began to back away fully from the service desk, stepping unevenly on an appendage, knocking him off balance. Regaining his composure, he began to back away as they drew in. Jimmy turned and sprinted toward the exit, hitting the doors before they could open automatically. Banging on them as he waited an eternity, he began to hear a terrified scream from the receptionist. Taking one last glance as the doors parted, he turned and resumed his sprint. Jimmy saw people dropping to their knees and the officer let out a soul-piercing howl. It was a sound that would haunt him the rest of his days. Diving into the car, he threw it into drive. Speeding away from the hospital, he was shaken and unclear on what he had just witnessed.